The most dangerous wars in modern history are no longer fought only with missiles, aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, or nuclear submarines. They are fought through supply chains so deeply integrated into the global economy that entire nations fail to recognize they are vulnerable until the moment those supply chains are turned off. And what happened this morning may eventually be remembered as the moment the United States discovered that the foundation beneath its military dominance was never fully under its own control. Because China did not launch missiles today, it did something potentially far more damaging over the long term. It activated a dependency that Washington spent 30 years helping create. At first glance, the announcement looked almost technical. Another bureaucratic statement from another ministry that most people outside trade circles never pay attention to. No dramatic threats, no military mobilization, no emergency summit. Just a short declaration from Beijing suspending exports of 17 critical rare earth elements and their processed derivatives to the United States and key allied nations. But if you stay with me until the end of this analysis, I'm going to explain why those 17 elements may matter more strategically than entire fleets of fighter jets, because without them, the systems modern military power depends upon begins slowing, degrading, and eventually stopping altogether. And this is where the situation becomes extremely dangerous, because the average person hears the phrase rare earth elements and imagines obscure industrial materials with limited strategic importance. That assumption is catastrophically wrong. Rare earths are not some secondary industrial resource. They are embedded inside nearly every advanced technological system the modern world depends upon. Precision-guided missiles, radar arrays, semiconductor manufacturing, electric motors, satellite systems, aircraft electronics, laser targeting systems, advanced batteries, communications networks, high-performance optics. The invisible architecture of technological civilization itself depends on materials whose supply chain China now dominates almost completely. And most people still do not understand what this really means, because the issue is not simply mining. That misunderstanding has distorted Western strategic thinking for years. Rare earths exist in multiple countries. The real power lies in processing capability. Separating rare earth elements into usable industrial forms requires enormously complex chemical infrastructure, environmental tolerance, industrial specialization, and decades of accumulated engineering expertise. China spent 30 years building that ecosystem, while Western economies outsourced the process gradually in pursuit of lower costs, faster production, and short-term market efficiency. Every individual business decision made economic sense at the time. Collectively, those decisions created one of the greatest strategic vulnerabilities in modern industrial history. Now think carefully about how extraordinary this is. The United States possesses the most advanced military systems ever built. The F-35 program alone cost more than the GDP of many nations. American carrier strike groups project power across oceans. Missile defense systems span continents. Artificial intelligence integration is accelerating rapidly inside military planning structures. But beneath all of that technological sophistication sits a fragile industrial reality. Many of the components required to build and sustain those systems rely directly on materials processed overwhelmingly inside China. That means strategic dependence exists at the material level itself. And if you thought that was bad, it only gets worse from now on. Because supply chains do not collapse instantly, they degrade in stages. Existing inventories create temporary buffers. Manufacturers continue production initially. Governments reassure markets. Analysts downplay immediate panic. But behind closed doors, military planners begin calculating depletion timelines. How long do current stockpiles last? Which systems receive priority access? Which production lines slow first? Which weapons programs become unsustainable if replacement materials fail to arrive? Those calculations are happening right now, and they are likely deeply alarming. Now let me explain why the F-35 issue alone reveals the scale of the problem. The F-35 is not simply another fighter aircraft. It represents the centerpiece of Allied Western air power strategy for decades moving forward. Multiple Allied nations structured entire future defense doctrines around its deployment. Air superiority planning, NATO integration, Pacific deterrence posture, carrier aviation modernization. Everything assumed stable long-term production and maintenance capability. But advanced aircraft are not assembled from ordinary industrial materials anymore. Modern aerospace systems require permanent magnets, high-performance electronics, specialized optics, advanced coatings, thermal management systems, and semiconductor architecture dependent upon rare earth processing at multiple stages. Remove those materials from the supply chain long enough, and the issue is not slower production. Eventually, production itself stops. That changes strategic planning immediately. Now stay with me because this next part explains why semiconductor vulnerability may become even more dangerous than the military implications themselves. Advanced chips are no longer just consumer technology. They are now the nervous system of modern civilization. Artificial intelligence systems, satellite communications, missile guidance, data centers, financial systems, cybersecurity infrastructure, drone coordination, autonomous systems, military command networks, precision manufacturing. Virtually every advanced strategic capability now relies on semiconductor production at enormous scale, and semiconductor fabrication itself depends heavily on rare earth processing. That means China's move is not simply pressure against defense manufacturing. It reaches into the technological bloodstream of the global economy itself. Now think about what happens when supply uncertainty enters a system already under geopolitical stress. Markets react first. Manufacturers begin stockpiling. Governments initiate emergency reviews. Military procurement planners reprioritize production schedules. Allied states begin competing quietly for remaining inventories. Supply security becomes national security overnight. And this is where the broader strategic picture becomes critical. Because China did not make this decision randomly. Timing matters enormously in geopolitics. Beijing understands that current Western military inventories are already under pressure from prolonged global tensions, regional conflicts, missile replenishment demands, naval deployment stress, and expanding technological competition. Consumption rates matter. Replenishment capacity matters even more. A military-industrial system functions effectively only if replacement production can sustain operational readiness over time. That assumption now faces serious uncertainty. Now let me explain why this becomes even more dangerous from a long-term industrial perspective. Building alternative supply chains is not something governments can solve in 6 months with emergency spending bills and political speeches. Mining projects take years. Environmental approvals take years. Chemical processing infrastructure takes years. Workforce specialization takes years. Manufacturing adaptation takes years. Entire industrial ecosystems cannot simply be recreated overnight because geopolitical tensions suddenly intensified. This is the consequence of strategic complacency accumulated over decades, and China understood that perfectly. Now stay with me because this next point explains why economic warfare is replacing traditional military escalation in many areas of global competition. Direct military confrontation between nuclear powers carries catastrophic risk. Everyone understands that. But economic pressure, technological denial, industrial dependency, sanctions, export controls, cyber disruption, energy leverage. These tools allow nations to weaken adversaries without crossing into open warfare directly. That is exactly the environment we are entering now. And Beijing may have just demonstrated one of the most powerful forms of economic warfare modern geopolitics has ever seen. Because unlike sanctions imposed by the West, which often depend on coalition enforcement and financial systems, rare earth dominance operates at the physical production level itself. You cannot politically negotiate around physics. If critical manufacturing inputs disappear, production slows regardless of political messaging. That is why this move matters so much. Now ask yourself a simple question. Why activate this leverage now instead of years earlier? Because Beijing likely believes the strategic timing is optimal. Western inventories are strained. Global tensions are rising. Supply chains remain fragile after years of disruption. Semiconductor competition is intensifying. Taiwan tensions continue expanding. Middle Eastern instability consumes American strategic bandwidth. European defense spending is surging. Military demand for advanced electronics continues rising globally. In other words, the West needs these supply chains now more than ever before. That is precisely why leverage becomes effective. Now let me explain why allied governments are probably even more alarmed privately than public statements suggest. Japan, South Korea, Germany, the United Kingdom, Australia. These countries are deeply integrated into advanced manufacturing networks dependent upon rare earth access, automotive production, electronics manufacturing, defense systems, battery technology, aerospace integration, energy transition programs. Entire national industrial strategies depend on materials whose supply security just became uncertain. That creates political pressure instantly, and political pressure eventually reshapes foreign policy calculations. Now, if you think this situation only affects economics, think again. Military readiness ultimately depends upon industrial endurance. Wars are not sustained by speeches. They are sustained by production capacity. Missile interceptors must be replaced. Radar systems require maintenance. Fighter aircraft need component supply. Naval systems require electronics integration. Satellites require semiconductor support. Artificial intelligence infrastructure requires advanced chip manufacturing. Industrial weakness becomes military weakness over time. That is the deeper issue here. And this is where the situation becomes truly historic. Because China spent decades building industrial dominance quietly, while much of the West prioritized financial efficiency, globalization assumptions, and short-term market optimization. Beijing accepted lower immediate profits in exchange for long-term strategic positioning. Processing infrastructure expanded, expertise accumulated, supply chains centralized gradually. Competitors disappeared over time. The result was not accidental. It was strategic patience operating on a 30-year timeline. Now stay with me because this next part explains why this may fundamentally reshape how governments think about national security moving forward. For decades, Western strategic thinking separated economics from defense planning too aggressively. Military superiority was viewed independently from industrial supply chain control. That assumption no longer holds. Economic interdependence was supposed to reduce conflict risk. Instead, it created new forms of strategic vulnerability. And China may have just exposed one of the largest vulnerabilities of all. Because the systems powering modern military dominance are only as secure as the industrial materials required to build them. Now imagine what Pentagon planners are calculating tonight. How many months of current production can existing stockpiles support? Which weapons programs receive priority access first? Which allied obligations become difficult to sustain? Which semiconductor systems face immediate pressure? How quickly can alternative processing capacity realistically expand? Those are not theoretical questions anymore. They are operational questions. And operational questions determine strategic behavior. Now, if you thought that was alarming, the geopolitical consequences become even bigger when you examine Taiwan. Beijing understands that long-term American deterrence credibility in the Pacific depends not just on naval deployments or air power presence, but on sustained industrial replenishment capability during prolonged confrontation. A military campaign is not won by opening salvos alone. It is won by sustaining operational capability over time. That requires production, and production requires materials. China now sits at the center of that equation. Now let me explain why this situation reveals something deeper about modern power itself. We often imagine power through visible symbols, aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, missile silos, satellites. But real strategic power increasingly comes from controlling the systems beneath those symbols. Energy flows, semiconductor fabrication, industrial metals, supply chain choke points, shipping routes, data infrastructure. Invisible systems create visible dominance, and the most powerful choke points are often the ones nobody notices until they close. That is exactly what happened this morning. A two-paragraph statement may have altered the strategic balance of technological power more significantly than many military deployments of the past decade, and most people still haven't fully understood it yet. Now here is where the situation becomes even more dangerous, because what China demonstrated with this move is not simply economic leverage. It demonstrated escalation capability beneath the threshold of war itself. That distinction matters enormously. In previous eras, global power competition was easier to recognize. Armies mobilized, fleets deployed visibly, missile sites activated, intelligence satellites detected military preparations. But 21st century strategic conflict increasingly operates through systems that appear commercial until the moment they become geopolitical weapons. That is exactly what rare earth dominance became overnight. And if you thought the military implications were serious, the technological implications may ultimately prove even more destabilizing. Because artificial intelligence changes the entire equation. Modern AI systems are not abstract software programs floating independently in cyberspace. They require massive physical infrastructure, data centers, advanced processors, cooling systems, semiconductor manufacturing, specialized electronics, high-efficiency magnets, precision optics, energy-intensive computation. Every layer of the AI revolution depends on hardware ecosystems deeply tied to advanced industrial materials. That means the future technological race itself may now sit partially inside Chinese supply chain leverage. And most people still do not understand how historic that is. Now let me explain why Washington's response options are far more limited than public rhetoric suggests. Politically, American leadership cannot appear weak in the face of strategic pressure from Beijing. That creates immediate pressure for retaliatory action, export restrictions, financial sanctions, technology controls, trade escalation, diplomatic confrontation. But retaliation works effectively only if both sides possess symmetrical vulnerabilities. The problem is that the vulnerabilities here are not symmetrical. China certainly relies on global export markets and advanced technology access in key sectors, but the United States and its allies rely heavily on industrial inputs whose replacement timelines may stretch years into the future. That creates immediate asymmetry and escalation endurance. And endurance matters more than opening moves in long-term competition. Now stay with me because this next part explains why the defense industrial implications may become extraordinarily severe over time. Modern militaries consume enormous quantities of precision technology during sustained strategic competition. Missiles are not single-use symbolic assets anymore. They are manufactured products requiring continuous replenishment. Radar systems degrade. Aircraft require maintenance cycles. Naval electronics require replacement components. Space infrastructure requires semiconductor integration. Military superiority depends upon industrial continuity, always has. But globalization created a dangerous illusion that industrial continuity would simply exist automatically because markets demanded it. That assumption is collapsing in real time. Now imagine the pressure inside Pentagon procurement discussions tonight. Which programs become priority protected? Missile defense systems? Naval radar architecture? F-35 sustainment? Semiconductor support for AI-enabled battlefield systems? Satellite infrastructure? Drone production? Every category matters simultaneously, but industrial constraints force prioritization eventually. That means strategic trade-offs become unavoidable, and strategic trade-offs reveal weakness. Now, if you think this crisis can be solved quickly through domestic mining expansion, the reality is far more complicated. Mining represents only the beginning of the supply chain. Processing is the true bottleneck. Separating and refining rare earths into industrially usable forms requires highly specialized chemical engineering ecosystems that China spent decades consolidating aggressively, while competitors exited the sector due to cost pressures and environmental restrictions. That expertise cannot simply be recreated through emergency legislation. You cannot fast-track 30 years of industrial specialization in 12 months. And Beijing knows that. Now let me explain why this situation becomes even more alarming when viewed through the Taiwan lens. Chinese planners study American military doctrine constantly. They understand that U.S. deterrence strategy depends heavily on sustained technological overmatch combined with long-duration industrial support capability. In any prolonged Pacific confrontation, replenishment timelines become critical. Missile consumption rates matter. Naval repair cycles matter. Satellite replacement matters. Semiconductor endurance matters. And every one of those systems intersects with supply chain dependency. That is not accidental leverage. That is strategic architecture built deliberately over decades. Now think carefully about what this reveals regarding modern geopolitics. For years, Western policymakers assumed economic integration would moderate geopolitical rivalry. The theory sounded logical. Nations deeply interconnected economically would avoid confrontation because disruption would harm everyone involved. But what actually emerged was something very different. Interdependence itself became weaponized. Economic integration did not eliminate strategic competition, it transformed the battlefield. Now the most powerful weapons are often invisible until activated. Rare earth dominance, energy choke points, semiconductor dependency, shipping route control, financial system access, cyber infrastructure, data architecture. Modern power increasingly operates through systems civilians barely notice during normal periods, until suddenly they become existentially important. And that is exactly what happened here. Now stay with me because this next point explains why Allied cohesion may face enormous pressure moving forward. Publicly, NATO allies and Indo-Pacific partners will emphasize unity. They have to. But privately, governments facing industrial disruption begin reassessing national priorities quickly. Germany worries about manufacturing stability. Japan worries about semiconductor continuity. South Korea worries about electronics production. Australia worries about trade retaliation. Every ally calculates vulnerability differently. That creates internal fractures over time. And Beijing understands coalition pressure points extremely well. Now let me explain why this may accelerate one of the largest industrial realignments in modern history. Once governments recognize supply chain vulnerability as a national security threat, entire economic models begin changing. Reshoring, industrial subsidies, strategic stockpiling, domestic processing incentives, supply diversification, allied industrial blocks, emergency manufacturing partnerships. The era of pure efficiency-driven globalization may be ending. Strategic resilience is replacing cost optimization. But rebuilding resilience is expensive and slow, very slow. That means the period between recognizing vulnerability and fixing vulnerability becomes the most dangerous phase of all, because adversaries possess leverage during that window. And right now, that window is wide open. Now, if you thought the economic consequences alone were severe, the military psychological consequences may become equally important. Strategic credibility depends heavily on perception. Adversaries study not only military hardware, but political endurance, industrial flexibility, and alliance confidence. If supply chain pressure visibly disrupts production schedules, delays weapons programs, or weakens technological momentum, perceptions shift globally. Perception shapes deterrence, and deterrence shapes geopolitical stability. That is why this move matters so much beyond economics itself. Now let me explain why semiconductor vulnerability could ultimately eclipse even rare earth concerns themselves. Chips are no longer just consumer electronics. They are the foundation of modern strategic civilization. Artificial intelligence, missile guidance, cyber warfare, space systems, financial infrastructure, military command coordination, autonomous drones, communications security. Every advanced strategic capability increasingly flows through semiconductor architecture, and semiconductor production itself depends on stable access to advanced materials and processing systems. That means industrial disruption eventually becomes technological disruption. Technological disruption eventually becomes military disruption, and military disruption eventually becomes geopolitical instability. This is the chain reaction strategic planners fear most. Now stay with me because this next point explains why Beijing likely calculated this move extremely carefully. China does not generally escalate economically without extensive preparation. This decision likely followed years of stockpile analysis, supply forecasting, industrial resilience planning, diplomatic positioning, and retaliation modeling. Beijing understands global markets will react. It understands Western governments will accelerate diversification efforts. But China may believe the short to medium-term leverage window is now worth more strategically than preserving unlimited long-term market share. That is a major calculation. And it suggests Beijing believes global confrontation risks are rising anyway. Now think carefully about what that implies. If China believes future strategic competition is becoming unavoidable, then preserving leverage during the transition period becomes critically important. Rare earth dominance provides leverage exactly where modern technological systems remain most vulnerable, at the material level itself. Now let me explain why this may fundamentally alter future military doctrine. For decades, strategic planning emphasized kinetic superiority, better aircraft, faster missiles, stronger navies, superior satellites. Those factors still matter enormously. But future doctrines will increasingly prioritize industrial survivability and material independence as core security objectives. Because advanced weapons systems become meaningless if production collapses during prolonged confrontation. And if you thought that realization was limited to Washington, think again. Europe understands it now. Japan understands it now. South Korea understands it now. India certainly understands it now. The entire global industrial system is reassessing strategic dependency in real time. Now, here's the most important point of all. China did not need to fire a single missile to create global strategic panic today. It simply restricted access to materials the modern technological order depends upon. That is 21st century power projection. Quiet, systemic, structural, deeply integrated into industrial civilization itself. And it may prove more destabilizing over time than traditional military escalation. Because military crises eventually end. Industrial dependency crises can last decades. Now ask yourself one final question. What happens if future global conflicts are determined not by who possesses the strongest military hardware at the beginning of a confrontation, but by who controls the industrial ecosystems required to sustain technological civilization itself during prolonged strategic competition? Because from where I sit, having watched geopolitical power evolve for decades, that may be exactly the world we are entering now. A world where invisible supply chains matter as much as nuclear arsenals, where industrial endurance matters as much as military courage, and where 17 obscure elements buried deep inside advanced manufacturing systems may suddenly hold more strategic power than entire fleets of fighter aircraft.